Hi, Professor. Obviously, my name is Alex, and I'm doing a report on the impact of COVID-19 on our education systems. To begin, I'd like to do some prefacing. Obviously, the COVID pandemic hit, and no one was really ready for it. It goes both ways. Obviously, our governments, they weren't really prepared for it. Some governments tried to ignore and poke fun at the virus. Other governments tried to cover up the outbreak in their country in order to protect the stability, save the economy, and then, the societal impact of it, of course, is that we ourselves weren't prepared for this either. So what this meant was the only option we had was just to lock down everything in order to slow the curve as much as possible. And in this scramble to build a new way of schooling, administrators were, just like the rest of the government, very unprepared, and this did not work out very well. So by the end of the decade, if you were a school administrator and you proposed the idea of preparing for a situation where students could only take class online for an extended period of time, not just from like a hurricane or something, you'd be mocked and laughed at and potentially at risk of losing your position. It just wasn't something that crossed people's minds. It was like, prepare for the zombie apocalypse, are you a prepper or something? Like, there are serious things that happen, and many countries just assumed, this is the modern age, we don't need to worry about that. We're a developed country, that's something undeveloped countries have to deal with. We'll be up and running extremely quickly after an event like that. An example I'd like to give would be after the Napoleonic Wars, all of Europe said, yeah, we're never going to have a war that bad ever again. Until World War I, and at the time it was called the Great War, and then the rest of Europe was like, yeah, Germany's never going to do anything like that again, that's crazy. Until 30 years later with World War II. So what I'm saying is that modern societies typically look back on past societies with, not insulting per se, but they think of them as not as intelligent, or just they look back on their ancestors as, oh, they didn't really know what they were doing. Wow, that was so stupid that you could think something so crazy like that. So what this meant is we developed as a society a stigma against preparing for things that we thought could never happen again, like the outbreak of polio that hit the United States for several decades at the beginning of the 20th century. Obviously the Spanish flu in 1918, the Black Death, that's all stuff that people say, we don't really need to worry about that, that's not going to happen, until, bang, the early months of COVID, and it starts to spread, and the West was just not really considering it as a threat. They were saying, it's not as deadly as the flu, they were saying it's just going to be another SARS, and going off of that precedent led to them being completely unprepared for this. Other countries that were more close by, such as South Korea, Bhutan, Taiwan, they began to prepare in 2019 for something like this, while other countries in the West didn't start preparing until the numbers were already in the 4 or 5 digit range, thousands and thousands of people getting it, hundreds and then thousands of people dying every day. So the thought was more about jokes and rather than practical solutions. Speaking of solutions, this is what I call the worst solution. So when the pandemic eventually arrived, there came the issue of continuing education during the lockdown. But administrators began to think of solutions after the storm had already hit. You don't go to Home Depot to buy plywood as a Cat 5 is landing. You have your shutters already up, and you have your water, and you're hunkered down, and you're in place, and you're ready, and you're prepared. And educational administrators were not prepared at all. And they didn't build off of any existing infrastructure because they just didn't have time. So, for example, in the state of Florida, the Florida Virtual Schooling System has served millions of students over the past 2 decades, but they didn't receive a substantial increase in funding, nor did they receive a substantial increase in students due to COVID-19. Why? It's a very easy way to fix things would be to switch everything to your online system that you've already had running. However, the problem was they didn't have enough time to adapt that system, and instead they had to put a band-aid on a bullet wound, to say, by getting a temporary solution. So in order to go up the ranks of any institution, you typically need to be experienced, obviously, and with that wisdom and experience, one is usually much older by the time they're at the top. Now what this means is these administrative officials were completely out of touch with modern technology. So they decided on a temporary solution to a problem that we still have today of education during the pandemic. So they decided to live stream class lectures as a direct replacement to the classroom, but keep all other aspects the same. An example of this would be making due dates 11:59 p.m. No teacher is grading work at 11:59 p.m. You're literally the second professor I've had that actually had a due date that makes sense, right before class. That's when we need our work, and you're going to be grading our work after class, so that's when it should be due. What teacher is grading their work at like 1 in the morning? It just doesn't really make any sense, but it's just a carryover from the old way of doing schooling, and it doesn't fit in the modern way that we have to deal with right now. Another thing that was very outdated was the use of Zoom. Now, there's plenty of other ways that schools could have, or there's plenty of other solutions schools could have used. For example, Microsoft Teams and tying that in with Microsoft Office, or Google Drive and tying that in with Google Meet, Discord, Skype even. These solutions would have worked way better than just a few-year-old startup called Zoom that had nowhere near the infrastructure to have that many schools copying each other and all streaming every day, every week, and they didn't have anywhere near the infrastructure security-wise either, so many classrooms would get broken into by people who wanted to cause trouble. That doesn't happen in a normal school. You have doors, you have locks, you have security. Zoom was not prepared for this. And the other side of it goes too, for privacy. For example, at my school, there was a scandal around the teachers still being able to hear you even though you click the mute button on Zoom. Like, imagine if you could read someone else's thoughts. I don't want my teacher to hear what I'm saying right now, so I click the mute button, but they can still hear me. Obviously, there's a problem there. So the final thing that I wanted to bring up was just the fact that it took so long for these educators to get retrained, because it took so long for these administrators to decide that COVID was something serious. My school district, for example, didn't stop at all. We hit spring break, and then we switched to online. They kept us in class for weeks, even though Florida's numbers were skyrocketing, just because they wanted to push towards spring break and hope we'd be back afterwards. That sort of short-sighted thinking is going to have a massive impact on society. So while these teachers were still struggling to find how to unmute themselves, or can you see my screen class, can you hear me class, constantly, this meant that these students were now forced to interact with each other in a world where you can't meet in person. So this led many to flood the sites like Discord, TikTok, and Omegle. Discord is a site where you can do calls, voice calls and video calls. You can stream your screen, you can watch other people live stream, and there's also servers which are somewhat like a subreddit, for example, or an internet forum would be a better example, where people can comment and send images and be like an image board and such. It's very versatile. Another one is TikTok, obviously. Everyone knows about TikTok. Short, like 7-second vines, basically, and you endlessly scroll through them. And then finally, Omegle, which is an anonymous video chat website where you communicate with people all across the world. So the way that these websites work is by using user retention techniques and algorithms in order to maintain their users for as long as possible. So what this meant was the generation using the internet the most, Gen Z, is now using it even more than anyone else. So these user retention algorithms push you towards more and more fringe communities. They see, oh, you like centrist content, let's show you right-wing content. You like moderately right-wing? Well, let's show you far right-wing. You like far right? And then they just keep pushing you further and further towards the fringe, which develops people with more and more extreme ideologies. And an example of an extreme ideology that I would like to use is the term stan, which is from the song in 2004 by Eminem about a fan who is so crazy obsessed with Eminem that he kills his pregnant wife and daughter as well as himself, just because he couldn't get Eminem to write back to him in a couple months. But now that term is used to describe a fan, obviously, who religiously follows every move of an individual or an ideology until it's every aspect of their personality and their life is consumed by that individual or that idea. And it's used by people to describe themselves. So it's a serious issue today. In fact, if we look at a continuing of the social impact, I'm going to go a little out of order here, but statistics have shown since the start of the new decade that teen suicide rates are rising even steadily, even steadier, even more steadily than they were in years past. And we also see much higher rates of teens being admitted to psych wards because of various mental crises, from anxiety to paranoia to depression to anger issues. And this is all caused because we were not able to solve the education problem properly in the West. So for example, so what I wanted to touch on is how important education is to us. Many people think of education in the way that the government thinks of education, as it's one small slice of the pie. But education really isn't one small slice of the pie anymore. At first, we had the ancient Greek philosophers, Muslim mathematicians of the High Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and this is all very important to humanity. One of the most important things to humanity is teaching, of course. However, after the 18th century hit and countries like the United States and Britain developed public education systems, now it was available to anyone in those countries. And then it became available to anyone in the world in the 20th century, which is great. It really is great. Except when you rip that fabric of society out from under them in such a short period of time, there was not enough time for these institutions to react properly. And so we decided to focus on replacing the textbook, right, by live streaming. But we didn't focus on replacing the classroom and the social interactions that come with it. And this social aspect of schooling, ever since public schooling was invented, it's been about group, not individual, but group teaching, right? And interactions with people in the hallways, in the classrooms, at lunch, at recess. And humans don't interact just by talking. We have faces that we have to see and gestures and activities to do. And all of this just led to people really suffering because of this lack of social interaction that we've become so accustomed to. And it was provided initially by the education system, and now people are struggling to find something to fill that hole in their void. So that's my presentation. Thank you, and thank you for this class.